Hello, my name is Sophie Roberts and I'm a speech and language therapist and a PhD student at UCL. The title of our talk is Towards More Effective Personalised Therapies for Aphasia. I'm going to talk first about some of the challenges in researching aphasia therapy, and will also present the results from a new therapy study. And then my colleague Tom is going to talk about predicting individual response to aphasia therapy. So first of all, aphasia is a communication disorder that affects roughly 1/3 of stroke survivors. It affects speech and language expression or understanding, or both, and it impacts social participation and quality of life. Aphasia can cause different kinds of impairment. The most common is word-finding difficulty. So, for an example, someone might have real trouble thinking of a word such as elephant, even though in their mind they know exactly what it is. Other common difficulties with aphasia include problems understanding when others speak, or difficulties with reading. Aphasia recovery varies for each person. Some people recover quickly within weeks, whereas others recover slowly after years. Recovery depends on stroke factors, so for example, the location of damage and how much of the brain has been damaged. Behaviour, so speech and language ability immediately after the stroke. Demographics, for example, how old someone is when they have their stroke. And therapy, which is the focus of the research that we'll talk about here. Therapy delivery varies depending on the therapist. This diagram on the right shows some of these variables. First of all, what? What is the therapy? What language skill does it target? Does it target speaking or reading or something else? And then how much and how often? How much therapy is enough, and how often does it need to be to cause significant, long-lasting improvements without being harmful? And when? When in the recovery pathway is therapy likely to be most effective? Early post-stroke, when the patient is still recovering, or later post-stroke, when the patient is more stable, but the brain is less plastic and potentially less responsive to therapy? Because of all of this variation, it's difficult to assess the impact of therapy. Therefore, current evidence for its effectiveness is weak. Research requires many patients in order to control for these different factors. This brings us on to the first study, where we used this approach of selecting a smaller group of patients from a wider pool. The aim was to investigate how therapy dose in the first month after stroke affects long-term speech production. And a key difference about this study compared to previous ones is that we studied clinical therapy. This means it wasn't given as part of a research trial, it was simply whatever patients received at the time after their stroke. We selected patients from the PLORAS database who met the following criteria. They all had a stroke in the left hemisphere of their brain. They were all conscious and alert 1 week after their stroke. This was so we knew that they would have been able to engage in therapy. They were either severely or moderately aphasic 1 week after their stroke, and this was because we needed to measure improvement, which we couldn't do for patients with milder aphasia who recovered quicker. And we selected patients for whom we could count and determine how much therapy they had in the first 4 weeks after their stroke. We also excluded any patients who had lots of therapy after that first month, and this was so that we could match the groups and control for any effect of later therapy on long-term recovery. We categorised those patients into 2 groups according to their initial severity, severe and moderate. We then categorised those groups again according to the amount of early therapy they received. Patients in the low therapy group received less than 1 hour per week. Patients in the high therapy group received 1 hour or more per week. We measured speaking improvements in two different ways. The first used self-rated scores. Each patient was asked to rate their speaking ability 1 week, 1 month, and 1 year after their stroke. The second way used scores from a standard aphasia assessment, which measures ability to retrieve words, repeat words, speak in full sentences, and write. Our results showed that when we controlled for multiple factors, there was a significant effect of therapy. More patients recovered after high therapy compared to low therapy. The chart shows the outcomes for each therapy group at 1 month and 1 year after the stroke. And the darker colour indicates severe speech difficulties. So you can see on the left, at 1 week, everybody had severe speech production difficulties. The lighter colours indicate recovery. You can see on the right-hand side, at 1 year, most high therapy patients, which is the top chart, are in the lighter coloured groups, which means most of them recovered. After low therapy, which is the bottom chart, about 1/3 of the patients are still in the darker coloured groups at 1 year, which means they still had severe speech difficulties. That concludes my part of the talk. I'm going to pass over to Tom, who's going to talk about predicting individual response to therapy.
Thank you, Sophie. So having established that higher doses of clinically routine therapy might be more beneficial than lower doses, we now turn our attention to attempts to improve on what is currently done. Now, I and my colleagues at UCL devote a lot of research to new therapies for aphasia after stroke. And one thing we very often see is that in any given therapy study, some patients will respond much better to the therapy under consideration than others. And in recent years, we've begun to ask ourselves whether these differences might be more than just random variation, or specifically whether we might be able to predict them ahead of time. To the extent that we can, this offers the compelling prospect of being able to recommend for each patient the particular therapy that might most accelerate their recovery. So I'm going to show you two results that, to my mind, show that this kind of recommendation might well be possible in future. So the first study is focused on treatment for reading impairment called I Read More. This is a computerized application. It can be used on computers or tablets, and it's designed for use at home in a self-administered manner over a period of weeks or perhaps months. So the idea is that the patient takes it home and it engages them in the mass practice of the reading of single words. They read hundreds and hundreds or perhaps thousands and thousands of words, and over time their word reading gets better. So in past work, we got a group of 23 patients to use this application at home for several weeks. And we found that as a group, they did in fact improve significantly in their reading. But exactly as we always find, some patients appear to respond much better than others to the treatment. So in order to try to predict those differences, we went back to the patient data that we acquired before the patients took the application home with them. So these data include demographic data, things like age at stroke onset, and sex. They include pre-treatment cognitive data, typically scores on standardized assessments of cognitive impairment severity. And they include structural brain imaging data, which we use to infer the extent and location of the brain damage that each patient has suffered. So we relate all of these diverse sets of pre-treatment data to the patient's treatment responses using machine learning. And crucially, we also simulate what will be required to predict treatment responses for new patients by dividing our group of patients into groups and making predictions for each group on the basis of models trained with data only from other groups. And the headline is that the predictions from this process are really not bad. So what we're seeing here is a scatter plot. Each patient contributes one circle to the plot, and each circle relates the predicted treatment response for that patient to the same patient's empirical treatment response. So if the predictions were perfect, then all of the circles would lie along the diagonal, where predicted response equals empirical response. So we can see from the plot that the predictions are imperfect. But remember that this is a small sample, and certainly these predictions are good enough to give us confidence that with a larger sample to work with, we might well be able to train models that make predictions which are accurate enough to be useful. So armed with what we consider to be good success in the first study, we thought we would apply similar methods to a different treatment, this time for naming impairment or anomia. So this treatment is structurally quite similar to I Read More. It's a computer application. It can be used on computers or tablets. It's designed for self-administered use at home over a period of weeks or months. So in many ways, it's very similar to I Read More, except that the focus, the task that it encourages patients to practice in is not reading, but picture naming. So here is an example where patients, in this case, the patient would have to say the word fruit to get the answer right. So again, as with I Read More, we conducted a group study where patients took this application home with them, and we found that as a group, those patients' naming skills did actually improve significantly. But exactly as in study 2, we found that some patients improved much more than others, so we sought to predict that improvement from pre-treatment data, where the data was much the same sort of stuff as it was in study 2, namely demographic data, pre-treatment cognitive scores, and structural brain imaging data. So just as in the previous study, we used machine learning to relate the pre-treatment data to the treatment responses, and we also simulated what would be required to make predictions for new patients by dividing the patients into groups and making predictions for patients in each group after training with data from other groups. And here again, the predictions really aren't bad. So this is a plot on exactly the same format as we have for study 2. Each patient, remember, contributes one circle to this plot. And exactly as before, we find the predictions are imperfect. They're not all precisely on that diagonal line where predicted score equals empirical score, but they're not miles away from it. And again, this kind of result gives us confidence that we can do well enough to be useful given more patient data to learn from. So that brings me to the end of those two studies. I'll just summarize what both I and Sophie have said, namely that first, we now have reasonably compelling evidence that higher doses of clinically routine therapy make for better stroke outcomes than lower doses, at least as regards the first month after stroke. And second, that individual variation in responses to specific therapies is at least somewhat systematic and predictable. So taken together, we hope results like this will open the way to a more effective and personalised rehabilitation science for aphasia, and indeed just a more positive science for the rehabilitation of aphasia.